As you heard, we are recording this presentation and we wanted to welcome all of you to our webinar series, Evangelization through the Corporal Works of Mercy. This morning, we are going to be listening on the topic of Queen Kapiolani and Sister Marriane Cope. Last webinar in August was about Queen Kapiolani and Saint Damien. And today we are going to hear from the perspective of the relationship of the Queen with Saint Marriane Cope. And again, this is hosted by the Damien and Marriane Catholic Conference. And we are really happy to be here. My name is Deacon Modesto Cordero. I'm the president and chair of the board of the Damien and Marriane Catholic Conference. And we are really happy to have you with us this morning. And we are going to go ahead and begin with introducing our presenter. Our presenter today is Ms. Colette Higgins, who is the Dean of Academic Affairs of the Windward Community College. Colette has been researching and presenting lectures on the life and legacy of Queen Kapiolani since 2002, emphasizing the Queen's visit to Kalaupapa in 1884 and her journey to London in 1887. Her sabbatical research in 2016 included retracing Queen Kapiolani's 1887 journey to London. Colette is a local girl. She was born and raised in Hawaii. She grew up mostly in Kaimuki, and now she lives with her husband in Kaneohe. She's a graduate of St. Patrick's School in 1980 and Kaimuki High School in 1984. Now, in 1988, she received an AA in Liberal Arts from Kapiolani Community College. Then she transferred to UH Manoa, where she earned her bachelor's degree in history and anthropology in 1990 and a master's degree in history in 1992. While attending UH Manoa, she was inducted into the Pi Theta Kappa Society, and she was a recipient of an East-West Center grant between 1990 and 1992. Colette was a professor of history at KCC, where she taught Hawaiian history for nearly 20 years, and from which she received the Francis Davis Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching in 2002, and the UH Board of Regents Excellence in Teaching Award 2007. We are really honored to have her with us. She also served on the board of directors for the Pacific History Park from 2011 to 2017, and in the Waikalua Local Fish Pond Preservation Society from 2011 to 2015, and at the Hawaii Council for the Humanities from 2017 to 2020. Now, since 2016, she has served as a board member for the National Pacific American Leadership Institute and at St. Anthony of Padua School in Kailua. Additional, I don't know how she finds time for all of this, but additionally, she shares her research as part of the leadership team for the Kauhana o Kalaupapa and as the historian for the Queen Julia Kapiolani Hawaiian Civic Club. She has served as a lector at various Catholic churches in Oahu since 1980, and as a homebound minister for the San Antonio Padua Church in Kailua since 1995. And I find out that she is going to go back to lecturing next year on 2022. She's going to leave the academic affairs position and going back to her roots as a professor of history.
Damien and Marriane conference in Honolulu.
People will be happy to hear her back. So please help me welcome Ms. Colette Higgins this morning. Thank you, Colette, with us.
Thank you.
Before I turn it over to her, we are going to start with a prayer. Again, let us begin in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And we wanted to share this morning, Lord, we wanted to thank you for all the blessings that you give us, for the opportunity to gather together this morning and to listen about Queen Kapiolani and Sister Marriane history through the eyes and through the heart of Colette, that she's going to guide us this morning. And as we prayed, we said, "Oh God, who called us to serve your Son in the least of the brethren, grant, we pray, that by the sample and intercession of Saint Marriane Cope, we may burn with love for you and those who suffer. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, God forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
It's
Thank
all
you,
yours,
Deacon.
Colette.
It's all mine. Okay. Welcome all. It looks like we have about 50 people oh gosh, can you hear that motorcycle? I hope not. Anyway, so
Okay.
today, it's okay.
Okay.
All right, so if everybody could mute, thank you. All right, so I'm gonna share with you some stories. So my research has been on Queen Kapiolani since about 2002, and I am a Catholic as well. I've been born and raised, and so I love it when my interest in Hawaiian history, especially Queen Kapiolani, merges with my Catholic faith, right? So this intersection is quite lovely to me. So Queen Kapiolani and Saint Damien. So I know for the Damien Marriane Catholic Conference, you guys want me to focus on the evangelization through the corporal works of mercy. So if you go back and you watch the presentation I did on Father Damien, I had listed the same, 7 corporal works of mercy. And with Kapiolani and the stories I was telling last time, we were talking about the first 6 is what she had done, with her charity work and how she was helping the people of Kalaupapa with Father Damien. But for this particular presentation, I'm looking at Saint Marriane. And when you look at Saint Marriane and the relationship she has with Queen Kapiolani and what they're doing and who they're helping, it's really, we can focus on 3 corporal works of mercy, and that's sheltering the homeless, visiting the sick, and visiting the imprisoned. And the visiting the sick and imprisoned kind of combine together when you understand what's happening at the Kaka'ako Branch Hospital and in Kalaupapa. So there's a picture of our queen in what in those days in the 1880s would have been like your traveling clothes. And then there's her signature that I found in a letter that she wrote to Father Damien. So just some important dates in the lives of the 2 women. So they are contemporaries, and you can see that Kapiolani is a little older than Saint Marriane. So Kapiolani was born on the Big Island of Hawaii in Hilo, and Saint Marriane was born in what is modern day Hesse in Germany. Different places, but just 4 years apart in age. Queen Kapiolani actually marries Kalakaua in 1863. He doesn't become king until 1874. And so those are sort of the important dates in her life, right, where things would change. And then for Marriane, she was admitted into the Sisters of the Third Order of St. Francis in 1862. Now, when it comes to Kapiolani, we do know that she visited Kalaupapa, and if you're interested in that, you have to go watch the other presentation I did with her and Father Damien. So she visited and spent a couple of days there in 1884, inspecting all the homes and whatnot. And then she also would open up the Kapiolani Home for Girls in Kaka'ako in 1885, following that trip to Kalaupapa, based on what the people there were asking her to do. Can you open a home for our girls so we can send them there so they don't get the disease? And so when it comes to Marriane, Saint Marriane, and where I want to kind of focus my attention today is really looking at the time that Saint Marriane spent on Oahu. So most people think about Saint Marriane and her work in Kalaupapa. She was there many, many years, right? Because you look, she arrived in Kalaupapa in 88. She dies in 1918. So really most of her life in Hawaii was in Kalaupapa, but my focus today will really be on her time on Oahu for the first 5 years, because that's when her and her sisters were working at the Kaka'ako Branch Hospital. And that's also after Kapiolani opened the home in 85, the sisters would be working there as well. So Saint Marriane and her sisters, and it wasn't a large group of sisters, but they were involved in actually doing a lot of work at the Branch Hospital as well as the Kapiolani Home for Girls. So of course, Saint Marriane lived quite a long life, all the way to 1918. Kapiolani dies at about age 65 or so in 1899. Okay, so they're contemporaries and they know each other, right? And they're friends, it seems. So this relationship to me is fascinating. So I like to start off with a quote from the Bible. I try to find verses that sort of make sense to what I'm trying to talk about. So this one kind of jumped out at me in Philippians. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. So when I look at this, I think I think this captures sort of what Kapiolani was doing and what Mother Marriane was doing. These women, now we think of Marriane as a saint, and of course Kapiolani, her day, she was a queen, right? So there's people who we look up to, but really when you start examining their lives are really about service to others, right? So they're not looking for ambition, they're not conceited, they're not in what the other translation was vainglory, right? They're not looking for glory. It's not based on vanity. It's all about how do I help others, and that's the focus that these two women have in common. And I think this is why they got along so well and they worked together nicely, is because they both were not looking for attention to themselves. They were looking to help others, and they focused their attention on the people with leprosy. So before I go any further, I want to do a quick sort of Hawaiian history for you. If you saw my other video on Father Damien, I do a little bit more. So I'm just going to do a quick rundown here. So the Kingdom of Hawaii, we had an independent kingdom recognized by many nations, right? And so our kingdom lasted not even the entire 19th century, right? From 1810 to 1893. We had 8 ruling monarchs in the history of our kingdom. The first 5 were the Kamehamehas, right? And so Kamehameha the Great unified the islands, and then 2 and 3 are his sons, and 4 and 5 are his grandsons. So in Kamehameha II, of course, he's the one that got rid of the old religion, the Kapu religion. Kamehameha III, we start seeing Christianity, like we embrace Christianity as a nation. We have constitutional monarchy, we have private ownership of land, all these changes during Kamehameha III's time. Kamehameha IV is Alexander Liholiho, and he's married to Queen Emma. So I'll talk about Queen Emma later, but they're known for opening up Queen's Hospital, right? Raising money to open up Queen's Hospital. And also they brought in the Anglican Church. And I don't know if you realize this, but Queen Kapiolani and Kalakaua, they're Anglicans, they're not Catholics. So that's Kamehameha IV. And then his older brother becomes King Kamehameha V. He's a bachelor king. So basically, based on the constitution that he wrote, they would have to have an election after he dies because he doesn't name an heir to the throne. So William Lunalilo was elected as king. He serves for only 1 year. He dies of tuberculosis. And then Kalakaua becomes king with the second election. And so he reigns for 17 years, David Kalakaua, until his death in San Francisco in 91. And then his sister, Liliuokalani, has already been designated as heir to the throne. And she rules for 2 years until a small group of American businessmen take over or overthrow the monarchy. And so the person I really want you to focus your attention on in terms of my chronology, my time period, and the stories I'm telling is really David Kalakaua, because we're talking about the 1880s. This is David Kalakaua's reign. His wife, his queen consort, is Queen Kapiolani, right? You can see that she's a couple years older than him, right? This is not her first marriage. This is her second marriage. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. But really, that's the person I want you to focus your attention on, is Queen Kapiolani. So just kind of putting her in the monarchy and the timeline. Sometimes people don't quite know where she falls and what time period we're talking about. So Queen Kapiolani and Kalakaua, 74 to 91. So we're looking at the 80s in this particular presentation. All right, so that's our Queen Kapiolani, our lovely queen consort of the reigning king, David Kalakaua. Now, when I started all my research on Queen Kapiolani back in 2002, when I was working at Kapiolani Community College, and a group of visitors were coming from the continent, or the mainland, we call it. And they came to our campus and they said, Colette, can you do a presentation on Queen Kapiolani? I was teaching Hawaiian history at the time. And I said, I don't know anything about Queen Kapiolani, right? So I went to the one book that has been published about her, and that was published in 1985. And that book is by Yardley and Rogers. And in that book, I found these quotes. So the 2 missions that were very close to her heart. One is the perpetuation of the Hawaiian race, because she was worried that the race was dying out, and she dreamed of one day founding a hospital for underprivileged Hawaiian mothers where they could safely have their babies. She said she wanted to, open this home so that the babies would live. And so we all know about this because of the Kapiolani Hospital, or Kapiolani Medical Center for Women and Children, which still exists today, right? So it started off as a maternity home so that the babies would live. And I think part of that is because she herself had experienced the death of a stillborn child she had with her first husband. But also she had traveled in 1887, and in New York, she had seen these new hospitals, these new maternity homes, very, very clean, and where women could have their babies safely without getting infections or the babies dying. And so that most people have heard about that because they know about the hospital, right? But her other mission that was close to her heart was the plight of the lepers. And I hate using the word lepers, I really do. But anytime I'm using it, it's only because I'm quoting it. So notice this book came out in 1985, right? So at that point in time, I know that there was this movement to try to not stop using the word, because that word it's derogatory, right? And it's really you're defining a person by their disease rather than who they are, right? Our queen didn't do that. Actually, she used the word, like she would talk about them as kapo'e ma'i, or the sick people or the patient. She wouldn't use this word, but this is what was printed in 1985, right? So she's worried about the people with leprosy. So Kapiolani personally continued to raise money through various charity events to improve the conditions of these unfortunate victims in Honolulu and Molokai. So just in that quote, you realize that in Honolulu, she's talking about the branch hospital, the Kaka'ako branch hospital. And then in Molokai, she's talking about the place called Kalaupapa, but also Kalawao. So Kalawao and Kalaupapa are two different sort of towns or areas on this larger peninsula, but we often talk about it as Kalaupapa. So that's the two places where people with leprosy were staying or living, right? Okay, so the connection in terms of leprosy and why her interest in this. So just like I think she opened the hospital because there was a sort of personal story or this understanding of the grief of losing a child, I think for her, she understood sort of that we need to care for people with leprosy because she saw her own brother-in-law with the disease. So her first husband, Bennett Namakeha, she was married to him from 1852 to 1860. And they were very a big age difference, right? She was 18 and he was 53 when they got married. So those pictures would be kind of what they look like when they got married, right? And so Bennett Namakeha had a brother, right? So his brother is George Na'ea. So when I first looked at Yardley and Rogers, that book, there was this sentence I saw: she became more compassionate when a close relative became a victim of this dread disease. And I kept thinking to myself, who is this close relative that became a victim of this disease? And what I came across as I was doing the research was, oh, George Na'ea, who happens to be the brother of her husband, her first husband, Bennett Namakeha, he dies of the disease of leprosy in 1854. And so you realize that in 1854, there was no Kalaupapa colony for people with leprosy, right? Our kingdom didn't start sending people with leprosy to Kalaupapa until 1866. So 1854, what happened if you had leprosy? You basically were cared for your family members at home. That's what happened, right? So she would have seen her brother-in-law, George Na'ea, with this disease because that's when she's married to her, to Bennett Namakeha, and they probably visited him or cared for him or helped, right? So when I read this in Moritz's book, so Dr. Moritz wrote a book, it's called The Path of the Destroyer, a history of the leprosy in the Hawaiian Islands and 30 years research in the means by which it has been spread. That book was published in 1916. And in it, he writes, George Na'ea, husband of Queen Emma's mother, was a leper in the year 1838, and he died in 1854. So when I first looked at it, now you realize that Queen Emma is married to Alexander Liholiho Kamehameha IV in the 1850s. That's when Alexander Liholiho is ruling as Kamehameha IV. This is his wife, Queen Emma. And so I looked at that. George Na'ea, husband of Queen Emma's mother, was a leper in the year 1838. George Na'ea, husband of Queen Emma's mother. What a funny way of phrasing it. That actually is Queen Emma's father, biological father. She was adopted by Dr. Rook, but her biological father was George Na'ea. He had the disease. He died of leprosy. So one of the terms Hawaiians have for this disease is ma'i ali'i. Ali'i means chief. So it's the chief's disease because this particular chief had it. So I just find it's interesting the way they phrased it there. Rather than saying it's Queen Emma's father, they say it's Queen Emma's mother. That is her husband. That is true. Okay, so that's the connection, I think, with leprosy and why she's not afraid of the disease. She's seen it up close and personal, and she cares for the people and wants to help them. So the story about Mother Marriane and the sisters coming, well, I think it was Queen Kapiolani probably who convinced the president of the Board of Health, Walter Murray Gibson, to actually invite some sisters of charity. So this is what they tend to be calling the sisters in general that come to assist. And so it's applied to the St. Francis sisters as well. So I think she knew of these nursing sisters, and she just wanted to find some nursing sisters from the United States who'd be willing to come to Hawaii to help the people and work at the hospital, the leprosy hospital. So I believe it was Queen Kapiolani who asked Gibson to do this. I don't have any documentary proof that, but a lot of the other stuff, sort of the circumstantial evidence and all the other stuff she does in terms of her interaction with the sisters, leads me to believe that she probably inspired him to, so he spoke to the Bishop Herman, who was in Hawaii at that time. And then, so they said, okay, we're going to send letters. Wrote all kinds of letters to all these different religious orders on the continental US to see if there would be sisters who wanted to come. So of course, Mother Marriane accepted this, and and was willing to come. And she had the experience of running a hospital in New York, right? So basically, when the king and queen gave their support, basically the Kingdom of Hawaii is going to pay for the sisters, right? It's going to house them, provide for their needs and whatnot, because they're going to be working at the hospital. And so when they arrived on the Mariposa, there's a picture of the Mariposa. Basically, the pilot boat came out. So the smaller boat came out to the ship when the Mariposa was in Honolulu Harbor. And the pilot boat was flying the royal colors, right? The royal colors of the flags, right? And asked if the sisters. So the guy comes out and goes, "Are the sisters on board?" And they said, "Yes, the sisters are on board." And so the boat goes back to Honolulu and announces to the king and queen, "Yes, the sisters have arrived," right? So 5 royal carriages came to meet them and to pick up the sisters. And then they took them to Our Lady of Peace Cathedral. So I find that, so there, right there is sort of the evidence in my mind of the support of our king and queen of these sisters to come here, right? So they kind of take them under their wings. Like, we're gonna bring you in, we're gonna treat you well. We want to make sure that we're so grateful that you're coming to help our people. And so there's a picture that, now this is a picture taken later in 1886. So it's not the same. There were 7 sisters who came. So Mother Marriane as Mother Superior with 6 of her sisters from St. Francis. And in red there, I've highlighted the 3 that were part of that original group of 7, right? So there were others who came later, I think April of 85. Others would come, like Sister Leopoldina, who we rely on a lot for, she wrote a memoir, I think, right? So there's the sisters. So we've got Rosalia, Christicia, and Mother Marriane are in that picture, right? And so is Walter Murray Gibson, the president of the Board of Health, right? So you'll see in some of these pictures, there was a series of pictures taken in 1886, and Walter Murray Gibson kind of sneaks himself in these pictures with the sisters. So they would have to work with him quite regularly, pretty much on a daily basis, especially at the beginning as they were trying to get that hospital well maintained. Yeah. Okay. So our queen and our king actually visited the sisters, not on the first day, because they arrived November 8th, 1883, but on the next day, the second day. So the day after their arrival, they were visited by the king and queen, who called in person at the Sacred Hearts Convent. So the Sisters of St. Francis, their convent was not built yet. So they had just arrived, right? And so we didn't have a convent yet. So while that was being built, at the beginning, they stayed at the Sacred Hearts Convent, and then they stayed later at the Mrs. Hazelden's home on King Street. So that would be the daughter of Gibson. So they stayed at her home for a temporary convent in November, December, until their convent would be completed in early January. So the day after their arrival, the king and queen would meet them at the Sacred Hearts Convent. They came quietly in separate carriages, the king and queen, that day, and without any ceremony. The queen only had one person with her, her maid of honor with her, and the queen thanked the sisters because they were taking up a burden that no one else would assume. From the beginning, then our queen wanted to make sure the sisters knew that she was very, very grateful for their help and their assistance, taking up this burden of caring for people who had leprosy. And so when I put shelter the homeless, so you noticed that there were the 3 corporal works of mercy. So when it comes to sheltering the homeless, in this particular example, it's our queen, it's our government, it's them supporting the sisters and making sure they are cared for and have a place to stay. So initially it's with the Sacred Heart sisters, but then they would find another place for them, and then they would build their convent right in the hospital there, so that they would have to care for the people, and that's where their convent would be. So they would be spending all their time there at the hospital. So also, on that day, so it needs to be translated because our queen does not speak English. She knows some English words. She probably understands more than she speaks, but she doesn't have fluency in English. So Gibson would be translating for her. And Sister Leopoldina Burns writes about this 45 years later, but she wasn't there at this particular event, but a similar thing happened in 85 when she arrived. And she heard about from the sisters what it was like when Queen Kapiolani came and visited. So Leopoldina says, I love that Queen Kapiolani said to the sisters, "I love you. You have left your home and country to come to these faraway islands to care for my poor afflicted children. I shall never forget you, and you are my sisters, and I shall always love you." So this tends to be the message every time Queen Kapiolani is visiting the sisters, right? She wants Mother Marriane and the sisters to know how grateful she is for them coming here. And she just expresses this great aloha or love to them, right? Aloha nui. And so Mother Marriane, we know that just the relationship must have been such that Mother Marriane did not hesitate to ask the Queen for assistance when she needed help, right? For all these efforts and all the things they needed to do at the hospital and whatnot. She needed Queen Kapiolani's assistance. And so there was great respect and affection for Her Majesty. So much so that it's expressed privately by Mother Marriane on the back of a small treasured photograph. So this is the photograph of Queen Kapiolani that was in Mother Marianne's possession. And Mother Marriane on the back of that photograph wrote, "Our mother, Queen Kapiolani." So Mother Marriane respected our queen and had such affection for her and realized that she's the person that she would go to for assistance and help, that Mother Marriane writes about Queen Kapiolani as our mother. So that just kind of shows you a little bit more to that relationship. I just love that little story and that artifact that goes with it that sort of demonstrates that relationship. So where did the sisters serve? It's really at the Kaka'ako Branch Hospital, and they served there from 81 to 88. So prior to that, so there was the Kalihi Hospital that opened in 1865. That was abandoned in 1875 and replaced with a leprosy detention station near the police station. There was no treatment and people were just locked up until they were sent to Kalaupapa. So what's happening then is they decided to open up in the Kaka'ako Branch Hospital. So they closed down the Kalihi one, right? And they thought they need to have a place where people could be treated. So they opened the branch hospital on December 12, 1881 in Kaka'ako. Dr. Finch treated 508 people in the first quarter of the first year. The people came forward when they found out they were not hurried away to Kalaupapa. The experiment of keeping people in Honolulu, the experiment of keeping people in Honolulu except for those who would disobey. So there's this idea that maybe we can treat the people in a hospital in Honolulu, and only if they disobeyed would we send them off to Kalaupapa, right? So maybe we can treat them here. So in November of 1883, when sisters arrived, more than 200 patients were in that Kaka'ako hospital. On a rainy day, it flooded. So there's a picture, sort of the same picture, right? But all flooded on a rainy day because in the Hawaiian past, in our history, that area of Kaka'ako was actually salt flats, right? That whole area of Kaka'ako was salt flats. So if you look at this map, you can see the leper hospital here on the map. And so the land here at what used to be called Fisherman's Point was donated by Princess Ruth Ke'elikolani. And she donated that land and it became the hospital, the Kaka'ako Branch Hospital. And so you can see here the hospital, you can see there's different salt flats or whatnot. So this whole area basically was known for salt flats, is where Hawaiians would produce salt. And by the way, Queen Kapiolani, her home is right here on Punch Bowl and Queen Street. So in 1863, when she got married to Kalakaua, he wasn't king yet. And so they moved into her home that is here up in this corner, right? So not too far from the hospital. Okay, so if you were to look at other maps and just sort of in comparison to what's there in 1885, here's the branch hospital in Kaka'ako. Here's where Kapiolani lives, right? And then you have Kauai Ha'o Church, and then you have Iolani Palace here. So it's all within walking distance, right? Not too far from each other. So the branch hospital here. So, you know, back in 1885, this is Honolulu Harbor. In present time, it's all filled in, right? So this is Ala Moana Boulevard. So we know that the Kaka'ako Branch Hospital and the Kapiolani Home for Girls that would be built in 85 is actually in this block, which today is the SALT project, or that development by Kamehameha Schools. So it's Ala Moana, Keawe Street, Auahi, and Coral Street, this whole block. So if you know Hawaii before, and this is the old Gold Bond building on this side of Ala Moana Boulevard. So a lot of this area in Hawaii was just filled in, right? It used to be on Honolulu Harbor. In fact, in one of the reports, they said that so when the ships would come in Honolulu Harbor, the patients at the branch hospital would stand out there and sort of wave at the ships, right? So they were right there at the water's edge, not like it is today where it's Ala Moana Boulevard. So that's where it is. I find it interesting that, you know, in that whole complex, that whole development that Kamehameha School does, they're focusing on salt plant and the salt projects or the salt flats, but they're not focusing on the fact that at one point in time in the 1880s, that was the Kaka'ako Branch Hospital for people with leprosy and the Kapiolani Home for Girls on that same block. Okay, so what did it look like? What was it like at that branch hospital? So there's some pictures of it. So on the left, a picture of some of those cottages at the hospital. You can see, you know, just sort of what it looked like. So it's not like a tall building. It's all these different cottages spread out. And then on the right is a sister's convent. So every now and then the king or queen or both, their majesties, together drove into the hospital yard and asked to speak to their afflicted people. So they would just randomly show up without announcing sometimes. Always the queen shed tears and the king looked sad. And always they spoke bravely to the patients and gave their aloha and mahalo, love and thanks to the sisters. So I'm quoting Hanley and Bushnell. So a lot of this information I just kind of pulled out of that wonderful book about St. Marriane by Hanley and Bushnell. And so the sisters even have an example of this sort of random visits of the king and queen without being announced, right? So the sisters moved into their convent on January 3rd, 1884. So there's a picture of their convent on the right. And Father Leonor blessed the building the next day. And then one day in December, they said when they were just getting ready for the convent, it wasn't quite ready yet. So one day in December, when the sisters were preparing the convent, King Kalakaua stopped by in his carriage with drivers and footmen, according to Sister Bonaventure. We were presented to him by his lordship, dressed in purple, who came with Father Leonor. And King Kalakaua thanked Mother very feelingly for having done them the honor of having come here to care for his sick people. So just randomly, the king or queen would just show up at the hospital to check on the patients. And then now that the sisters were there, to check on them as well and to thank them yet again. Thank you, thank you, thank you for coming to help our people. So the dedication of St. Philemon Chapel in January of 21st, 1884. So I just told you that the sisters moved into their convent January 3rd, 1884. So they were living in the Mrs. Hazelton's home in King Street in November and December, right? So at this particular dedication ceremony, Queen Kapiolani attended, and then Mother Marriane writes about it in her report in 1887. She said, Mother Marriane noted that Queen Kapiolani was still in deep mourning for her sister. And so she seemed much affected during the service. So I read things like that and go, oh, who is this? The sister, right? So the sister is Kekalike. Her youngest sister, Kekalike, died on January 8th, 1884. And the queen had actually in December, a couple of times in December, had asked the sisters to come and visit Queen Kapiolani's sister Kekalike, who was very sick, to come and pray for her, would be my guess, right? And so this is an example of Mother Marriane visiting the sick. Now, she cared for many, many sick people, right? All the people with leprosy in Kaka'ako as well as Kalaupapa. But in this particular example, she's being called on by the queen to come, dear Mother Marriane and your sister, so please come and visit my sick sister. And so here's Mother Marriane visiting Princess Kekalike. So where did they go? They went to Kekalike's home. And Kekalike's home is known as Ululani, and it's actually located near Beretania and Makiki Street. So it's her home. And if you know Hawaii, that would be where Beretania Foodland was, I think, right? It's not there anymore. Anyway, Beretania Foodland there is where the home would have been, Kekalike's home. So this is where the carriage comes to pick them up. So the royal carriage came to the temporary convent of the sisters, right, on King Street. And then Her Majesty's sister was very sick and desired to see Reverend Mother and the sisters. So Reverend Mother and the two sisters answered the call. This is Sister Leopoldina writing. And then Sister Bonaventure remembered that the queen sent 2 carriages for us to come and see her sister who is very sick and not expected to live. And so St. Leopoldina also continues and said the queen, so since Father Leonor, he comes and he fetches the sisters, he says, the queen's asking for you, please come and visit Princess Kekalike. And so his carriage, he went ahead of the royal carriage to the house of the queen's sister. It was a beautiful castle, is how Sister Leopoldina describes it. This is the home. It was a beautiful castle and everything rich and grand. The poor lady was indeed very sick. The queen accompanied them to the door. She lovingly took Mother's hand in both hers and placed a $100 bill in it and said, "This is not to be the last. You are my sisters. I love you, and you will always be my sisters." And that's Sister Leopoldina's writing in her writing of that event, of what happened there. So that's where they visited Kekalike. She did die on January 8th, 1884. After her death, the home actually goes to her sons, right? And Kapiolani becomes the guardians of those sons. And so this home, Ululani, becomes the first location of the Kapiolani maternity home, which would be the forerunner of our Kapiolani Medical Center for Women and Children. And so the maternity home that she opened up in 1890 is in her sister's home, the same home that the sister, Mother Marriane, had visited back in 1884. So just a side note in terms of Kekalike and who she is, because I like to put things into Hawaiian context. context. So we know that Kekalike is the youngest sister of Kapiolani. So Kapiolani has two sisters, Po'omaikalani, who is 7 years younger than her, and we'll talk about her a little bit later on a visit to Kaka'ako. And then we have Kinoiki Kekalike, this one, Princess Kekalike, who is actually 9 years younger than Kapiolani, and she dies when she's only 41 years old. And this Princess Kekalike, it's her three sons, Kapiolani's nephews that we have heard about, right? David Kawananakoa, who's in the center there seated, Edward Keli'i Ahonui, and he is standing there on the right, and he dies at 18 years old in 1887. And then Jonah Kuhio Kalaniane'ole standing there on the left, the youngest of the three brothers. And so these are the three that Kapiolani would have to care for after her sister had died. So they become the princes, right? They're designated as heirs to the throne. So Kawananakoa, Kalaniane'ole, they're designated as heirs to the throne. So there's a picture of David Kawananakoa. And I think if there was a monarchy today, it might be a Kawananakoa, because David Kawananakoa was in line for the throne, right? And he's the only one of the three boys who had children or offspring. And then Princess Jonah Kuhio Kalaniane'ole, he actually served in the in Congress, right? So he served as a delegate to Congress representing the territory of Hawaii for 20 years, from 1902 to 1922. And he's the one that gave us the Hawaiian Homes Commission, Hawaiian Homes Act, right? So we have Hawaiian homelands because of him. So these are famous people in Hawaiian history. And these are the nephews of our Queen Kapiolani. These are and these are the sons of Kekalike. So when they're visiting the mother who's on their deathbed, they likely probably met the boys as well. And I can only imagine that they were also there. A lot of times in Hawaiian culture, whenever somebody is dying, high-ranking ali'i is dying, all the other ali'is come by and surround them, and they're there at the house, at their bedside, there with them. So I'm sure the sisters met these boys as well. And then we have, so back to the dedication. So that was my little side note to tell you that just that one observation of Mother Marriane, of how Kapiolani was so sad, was because her sister just died on January 8th. So here she is. It's important to her that she be there at the dedication of the St. Philemon Chapel on January 21st, 1884, even though it's only been weeks since her sister has passed, right? So she is grieving still. In attendance is our Queen Kapiolani. She's attended that day by Mrs. Iaukea, so that's Curtis Iaukea's wife. And then we have Walter Murray Gibson and his daughter, Mrs. Hazelton. So Hazelton, that's the one where they were staying at her home in King Street, right? So our sisters were staying there as a temporary convent, was her home on King Street. We have Bishop Herman, who performed the ceremony. The five priests that were there was Damien, Clement, Sylvester, Leonore, and Bouchard. I think one of them is a Jesuit priest. Of course, we all know Damien, right? Saint Damien. He was there. And this is the first time that Mother Marriane is meeting Father Damien. So this is the first time the meeting of the saints is at this event in Kaka'ako at the dedication of the chapel for the sisters. So Father Damien happened to be visiting Honolulu at that particular time. And then we have the Mother Superior and St. Teresa from the Sisterhood of the Sacred Heart. So we do have Sacred Heart sisters already here. The whole missionary, the Sacred Heart's fathers and sisters were all here prior to the Sisters of St. Francis. But what makes the Sisters of St. Francis different are that they are nurses. So they're nursing sisters, right? While the Sacred Heart sisters are the teaching sisters, right? So at this particular dedication, Gibson loves to give speeches. So there's lots of speeches that have been published by Gibson. And Gibson, even before the ceremonies start for the chapel, but with the bishop running those ceremonies, he gets up and he addressed the people. So before the ceremony commences, Gibson addresses them, the people there from the hospital, and he says, it had been the earnest desire of their majesties and of the government to devise and carry out measures to alleviate their sufferings. So he's talking to the people at the hospital, the leprosy patients. Hence, skilled physicians had been sent for, and ladies who devoted their lives to the nursing and care of the sick and suffering had come across the seas to minister to their wants. They would rejoice at the presence of these worthy sisters who had already entered upon their work. So basically in these his speech, he's talking about the sisters. So he's talking about how their majesties have asked for the sisters to come, and the ladies who devoted their lives to the nursing care of the sick and suffering, that's the St. Francis sisters, right? And they're going to have this big ceremony at their chapel soon, and that very day. And so this morning, Her Majesty, he continues, this morning, Her Majesty, their good queen, was present, having come to manifest sympathy and rejoicing with any and every effort that was made to promote the health and welfare of the people. And as to the sisters, he would say that they had all great reason to be thankful that these noble-hearted ladies had left home and duties elsewhere to come and devote themselves to the care of the sick poor of this kingdom. So basically, they are coming to Hawaii to care for our leprosy patients at the Kaka'ako Branch Hospital. So when I put here, visit the sick and the imprisoned, the reason I say that is because at this point in time, when it comes to the 1880s and the people with leprosy, what's happening is that our kingdom of Hawaii has they use words that seems to criminalize these people who have the disease. So they talk about them as being arrested by bounty hunters and exiled to Makanalua, which is the peninsula where Kalaupapa is located, for a life sentence. Like, these all sound like these are words we used to talk about criminals, but these are people who are sick, right? And so even so much so that if you had leprosy, it could be it's adjudged that you were civilly dead, and therefore you could remarry again because you're considered civilly dead. So it's very interesting the words used: bounty hunter, arrested, life sentence, right? These kinds of things for people who happen to be sick, but that's how they were treating them, right? So when you're visiting the sick in Kaka'ako or in Kalaupapa, even when you're visiting the sick, you're also in Hawaii at that time visiting those who have been imprisoned, basically, right? They have been told they can't leave this place. So it's not just a hospital where you go and get better and leave. It's you're stuck there. The only other place you're likely to leave to after this is likely Kalaupapa on the island of Molokai. Yeah, so back to my presentation here. So the dedication of St. Philemon Chapel, the procession passed through the main aisle of the building, and there was chanting the solemn dedicatory hymns. And then they walked all around the building, right? So around the building, doing all the dedication ceremonies and whatnot, the prayers. And then they come back and they have a mass. And the way it's phrased in the newspapers is Pontifical High Mass was celebrated. And then we have the Kyrie, the Gloria were chanted by the choir, which is chiefly composed of the patients themselves. And then they even describe Bishop Herman as visibly moved by the solemnity and peculiarity of the occasion with this audience. And he was visibly affected and in tears, evidently. And then so Her Majesty was there. She attended the whole ceremony. They even say that the choral part of the service was quite pleasing, and unexpectedly pleasing, was quite beautiful. And Mr. Van Giesen presided at the piano. That's an interesting note. So I'll talk more about Van Giesen, but he was playing the piano at this particular event. And when Her Majesty drove away after the ceremony on this day, after the conclusion of the ceremony, she cried out to the assembled patients, "Aloha nui o ko," which was greeted and replied to by loud and anonymous aloha, aloha from the people themselves, right? So aloha nui oko is just, in Hawaiian, it's just love, lots of love. Aloha nui oko is just lots of love to all of you, yeah. And so this is one example of this sort of this intersection, I guess, if you will, or this meeting up of Mother Marriane and Queen Kapiolani, right, at this particular event, right? So I want to tell you another story, though not as nice as that particular one. The headlines in the newspaper on March 8th, 1884, in the Pacific Commercial Advertiser read, "Excitement at Kaka'ako." That was the headlines of what had happened the day before. Now, you should know at this point in time, March 7th, 1884, you realize the sisters have only arrived in November 3rd, 1883. Their home in Kaka'ako is opened on January 3rd, 1884. And then Mother Marriane is called away to Maui to open up the Malulani Hospital there in Wailuku, Maui. So at this point in time, in March of 1884, Mother Marriane is not at Kaka'ako. And so that's interesting because I think this Van Giesen guy probably wouldn't have misbehaved so much or wouldn't have gotten in trouble as much if Mother Marriane was there. But anyway, during this particular event, just a summary of what happened. Van Giesen, who happened to be in the habit of calling on the sisters in the middle of the night, right, just to bother them, ring the bell, call them over in the middle of the night. He tended to do that, so he's kind of bothering them. He wouldn't do it as much when Mother Marriane was there, but he kind of was doing it more when they were there. And then what had happened was the patients don't like Van Giesen. Van Giesen is not, he's the steward of the Kaka'ako Branch Hospital. He's not doing a very good job of it. The sisters come and inspect it when they first arrive in November, and the 200 patients there, and it is not in good shape. It's not up to the level of cleanliness and care the way the sisters are used to, right? And part of the reason is because Van Giesen he disrespects the patients, even though his wife has the disease, right? Which is part of the reason why he's there. And unfortunately, our queen, I think, was somehow associated with putting him in that position. I think Leopoldina Burns is the one that mentions him as the Queen's white man or something like that in one of her writings. But anyway, Van Giesen wasn't a very good steward of this hospital. That's saying it kindly. So one night, 5 a.m. and actually in the morning, 9 patients roughed him up. So they basically, they accused him of adultery because there were a couple of women sleeping with him in his room at that time. In his locked door, they pound through, they get through, they pull him out, they drag him by his hair, and they're roughing him up, right? And finally he calls the alarm, the guard comes. And so all these guys were locked up in jail, right? And so remember what I said, that they were thinking of coming up with a hospital and caring for people there unless they misbehaved. And so now Gibson, you know, is saying, well, these people have misbehaved, right? They've roughed up the steward, basically the guy in charge. So now they're going to be sent to Kalawao, right? So the decision is really made to send them to Kalawao. So Mother Marriane is not there at this event, right? I think it might have played out differently had she been there that day. But what they do is they call on our Queen Kapiolani. So Queen Kapiolani shows up with her sister, her sister, who is the one 7 years younger than her, Pumaikalani. And so she shows up with her sister. They arrive about 10 a.m. All the patients assemble in front of the sisters. And then Gibson gets up and he gives his speeches, right? And his speech, and he says that, you know, what you have to do is we have to separate you. We can't, you know, have, the reason you're here is because we have to save the people who are well, and we're afraid of the spread of this disease, right? So Kapiolani gets up and she addresses them as well, right? And Queen Kapiolani expresses her great love for the suffering, and she just urges them to be obedient, right? So this is yet another example when you look at the corporal works of mercy. What can somebody like a queen do? Well, when Mother Marriane isn't there, they call on her to help calm things down, to talk to the people, to express concern, and just kind of, they're going to be much more respectful in front of the queen. In fact, one of the men had written a letter to the royal family, so to the queen, and had asked her for help. And they basically, in the letter, they're basically saying, so this Reverend Kawa, he's a patient, and this is what he's saying. He says the good sisters and their constant care is well ordered, and the hospital makes it painful to leave. So this is an interesting problem we're having now, right? So maybe before, when they sent to Kaka'ako Branch Hospital was so bad that they, you know, maybe if you sent to Kalaupapa, maybe that's a better place than Kaka'ako. I don't know, but what's happening is the sisters are doing a better job of caring for the people. Ever since the sisters arrived on the scene, things are cleaner. The sisters are very respectful of the patients. They're caring for them. They finally have good nursing care. They never had that before at Kaka'ako. So now it's hard to leave. Why can't we stay here? There are no nurses in Kalaupapa, but there are nurses here in Kaka'ako. So that's part of the reason. So now people are on a list. They have to go to Kalawao. And that's part of the reason we think this riot or whatever that occurred the night before, right? It happened at 5 a.m. or that early morning. Those 9 guys were on the list. They were on the list to go to Kalawao or to Kalaupapa, and they didn't want to go. Things are good here, according to Reverend Kawa. Things are good now with the sisters here. We don't want to leave. But after the queen gets up, you know, Gibson gets up, gives his speech. The queen gets up and gives her speech, and expresses to them that they need to do this for the sake of the others, you know, so the disease doesn't spread, so we can, for safety of the people who are well. So after that, they come forward on their own and they volunteered to go. So 39 came forward, and then they were sent to Kalawao. There was a ship that day that went to, that picked them up and sent them to Molokai, to Kalawao, which is the same peninsula where Kalaupapa is located, right? And so this is where the queen just got involved, and she helped in a way because Mother Marriane wasn't there, right? It's all very sad if you think about it, but I just find it interesting that part of the reason why they're upset is because they don't want to leave the hospital because the sisters are caring for them there. Yet they bring in the queen to express, you know, that you really should. And when the queen left, of course, they're all, you know, cheering, and there's great hurrahs and everything as she leaves. So they bring her in to calm things down. So that's the excitement at Kaka'ako on March 7th, right? And it's a much larger story. If you read Henley and Bushnell, the book about Mother Marriane, they go into greater detail on the whole build up on all this whole Van Giesen thing that was going on there. So by the way, Van Giesen leaves shortly thereafter. So I don't know if Kapiolani pulled strings or whatnot. So, you know, it was probably her mistake in putting that guy in charge, right? And then, you know, with the sisters keep nagging, it was, I think Bishop Herman had to get involved, and Father Leonor and others, to really insist that this Van Giesen guy needs to go, because that was kind of the complaints. There's lots of complaints regarding him. So he leaves sometime after March 1884. So Mother Marriane shows up again, I think about a week later or so, and starts, you know, politicking and saying we really just need to get rid of this Van Giesen guy. he is sent to Kalaupapa. And so Queen Kapiolani would run into Van Giesen again in Kalaupapa when she visits in July of 1884. And so she sees him again there. So at some point between March and July, he leaves Kaka'ako. Yeah. So I want to tell you about another more happier visit at Kaka'ako by our royal family, our king and our queen. So when we take a look on the royal visit at Kaka'ako Branch Hospital, on May 23rd, 1885, there's a picture from the actual let's see, the newspaper, right? And that's you can see the headline, a royal visit to the leper hospital at Kaka'ako, affecting scenes, royal sympathy for the unfortunate inmates. And see the word they're using again, it's a hospital. They're not calling them patients, right? They're calling them inmates. So this is why I say it's visiting the sick and the imprisoned when you go to Kaka'ako Hospital, right? The Mother Superior and sisters thanked by their majesty and the proposed home for Hawaiian girls. So by May 23rd, 1885, they're working on building the home for girls, right? And so when the queen visits and the king and queen are visiting in 1885, the people know that they're coming. It's a big deal. They're going to come and they're going to visit. So they're all prepared. The king and queen arrived shortly after 11. They were received by Gibson. And they actually had a meeting, quite a long meeting, it seemed like, with Mother Marriane and the sisters to learn more about what's happening and the improvements that were made. They visited the sick wards with Mother Marriane and Mr. Gibson, the president of the Board of Health. And then they looked, and you could see that the flower beds had been shaped at the very talented gardeners, somebody was, that they shaped one of the flower beds like an anchor to represent truth, another flower bed shaped like a cross to represent hope, another flower bed shaped like a heart to represent charity. Yeah. And so the flower beds are cut to form aloha in large letters. Yeah. Kalakaua and Kapiolani were actually cutouts in the grass as well. They cut out the names of Kalakaua and Kapiolani. And then the queen recommends, she said, you should also add the motto, the cutout of her, the motto really of the nation, right? Ho'olu lahui. That is King Kalakaua's motto, Ho'olu lahui. This is a different take on it. It's Ho'ola lahui. And Ho'ola lahui means to heal. Ho'ola is life, is to make life or heal. And so the heal the lahui, the nation. So she wanted them to cut that out in the grass. Okay, so basically, so that's what we see out in the gardens, which they must have been tending to, because when you look at this picture, it looks very barren, right? Salt flats and everything. So some care has been taken to grow some flowers and some grass in that area, which must have been quite hard, but evidently they were very impressed by this. They go in and they take a whole tour of the area. So they toured the different departments. They were clean with the cleanliness. So notice the date. This is May of 1885. So the sisters have been in charge now for about a year without Van Giesen around, right? So they basically had cleaned up the place. They've ordered a new cooking range. So they got rid of the old kettles that the food were being made on. And the kitchen used to be one of the awful places in terms of cleanliness. It wasn't. So the sisters cleaned it all up. There's a new range for cooking. The old kettles that had been used for cooking were now being used to make soap. They made large quantities of soap right there from the fats obtained from the cooking. And then they passed through, you can see in this picture, the double swing that had recently been installed. So we do have children at this Kaka'ako hospital, right? And so they have installed, recently they had installed swings. So I think that picture to the left actually shows you the swing set, right? That was recently installed. And then they even looked at the schoolrooms, the bright, clean schoolrooms, and they talked more about the home for the girls that would be built, right? So this is, she's already visited Kalaupapa, and we'll talk more about that soon. She visits Kalaupapa in July of 1884, comes up with the idea of building the home for girls, and then they're building it at this point in time, and it will be opened by November. So at this point in time, there are clean rooms, everything's clean. So it's a visit where they can show the king and queen that we have definitely changed things here at Kaka'ako Branch Hospital. The king and queen paused for a few moments to exchange greetings with the female patients gathered on the verandas of the neat cottages in which they lived. The queen recognized among them an old acquaintance, and towards her, as well as the rest of the poor victims of this dread, mysterious malady, her kindly, sympathetic nature was shown in her questions regarding their condition and the thanks that she, as well as Her Majesty, tendered to the Mother Superior and her sisters for what they had done and were doing for the lepers. So that was a quote from the Pacific Commercial Advertiser on May 25th when they were talking about this visit. So there's a picture from the Kaka'ako branch hospital, some of the people there. So you can see the verandas of the cottages and how she would have been greeting them and speaking to them, right? So she visits and she is listening to them. So when they leave, they says, in taking their leave, their majesties thank the Mother Superior for the care she and her sisters associated with her were taking of the unfortunates under their charge. As they passed out of the grounds, they were again cheered. So that's again the Pacific Commercial Advertiser. And it's really hard to find an actual photo with both Queen Kapiolani and King Kalakaua in the same photo. We got these different photos of them, but the ones that I have found are actually in the gardens of Iolani Palace. So this is one of those photos that I just put up there so you can see the king and queen actually in the same photo. Anyway, so we know that things got better. The sisters improved things over at Kaka'ako Branch Hospital just in 1 year's time. So great improvement there. So I want to tell you the story, though, about how the the Kapiolani Home for Girls opened up. So it starts off because people were writing to the Queen and they're writing to the legislatures. They're petitioning and they're asking the government to send someone to come and investigate what's happening in Kalaupapa because they need some help. They need improvements there, right? So again, visit the sick and the imprisoned. So not just at Kaka'ako. Remember, we're using words like inmates, arrested, bounty hunter, life sentence, right? So the government is treating them like they're prisoners, right? Because they're sick with this disease and they're being isolated, right? So Kalaupapa has been set up as the, we talk about Kalaupapa today, we often will say, so this is the island of Molokai, this is Kalaupapa, which is the peninsula. That's actually Makanalua Peninsula, but today we tend to just talk about it as Kalaupapa, the peninsula, when it's actually Makanalua is the name. But actually the town itself is on the right. You can see Kalaupapa on the right-hand side. At this point in time in the 1880s, when the Queen visited and when Father Damien was living there as well, it's Kalawao on the left where most of the people lived. Over time, they would move to Kalaupapa, where today, if you visit, they're mostly in Kalaupapa. But Father Damien's church is still out in Kalawao, right? Because that's where all the people lived, mostly in 1880s. So she visits this peninsula. As you can see, it's isolated, right? The whole point was to isolate these people, to quarantine them, if you will, right? To isolate them from the rest of the population so the disease wouldn't be spread. Even though today we know that only about 5% of the population can actually get leprosy, right? In those days, they didn't know. There was no cure, not until the 1940s or so would we get a cure for leprosy. So they just isolated them. So if you look at this, the pallies of the cliffs are on one end. So that's the top side Molokai, the island of Molokai, right? And then they're separated because there's all this water around all the rest of it. So, and they're rough seas, right? So it's hard to get to Kalaupapa. It's not easy to leave from. It's not easy to get to. So therefore, this would be the place where we should isolate them. And so it was decided in the 1865 with the law passed by the government that's going to segregate all these people with leprosy. 1866 in January, they sent the first group of 12 over to Kalaupapa. So when the Queen visits, she actually is met by an Ambrose Hutchison. Ambrose Hutchison had arrived in Kalaupapa in 1879, and he served as a resident superintendent there for 14 years, right? He lived 53 years and 6 months at the settlement. Ironically, it was his father, Dr. Ferdinand Hutchison, who recommended the isolating leprosy patients at Kalaupapa when he served on the Board of Health in 1865. So ironically, so Ambrose Hutchison was sent there in 1879. He dies in 1932, I believe, right? Over 53 years there that he spent. So Hutchison served as the assistant superintendent. He has served as assistant superintendent. And so when Kapiolani visits, she's met, she's visiting along with Lili'o Kalani, and there's a number of people in her party traveling as well. And when she visits, they're met by Ambrose Hutchison, Father Damien, Father Albert, and they're met, and then they're taken to this place where people are all assembled, and they're going to start telling the Queen of all of their problems, right? And how she can help. So the Queen, when she gets up and she addresses her people before they get up to explain what their needs are, she says, "I've heard told of so much misery and suffering among you, my dear people, segregated from all you hold dear. I intend to personally inspect your homes, to individually meet you and to talk to you and to see with my own eyes the conditions you are in, that I may bear witness to tell the King of your needs." Right? So the Queen is going to come, and she is actually going to come and inspect their homes. She wants to see every single home, and that's exactly what she does. Ambrose Hutchison is actually traveling with her into every home to inspect every home, to ask them how she could help, how she could meet their needs. And so the last speaker was the superintendent. This is Ambrose Hutchinson talking about himself. He always writes this way in the third person. While he was still speaking, a girl child of about 2 years old had escaped from its mother in the crowd and found her way to the front where the speaker stood, poked her head around the ankles of the speaker's legs, piped its childish voice, "Papa, Papa." The speaker stooped down and lifted the child up, who put her tiny arms around the speaker's neck, an act of providence through an innocent child to inspire the speaker's mind with an idea unthought of until that very moment, which became a realization 17 months thereafter, turned the child about to face the queen. Here is a non-leper child, one of many. Must she and the other children like her be left to their fate to become victims of this dread scourge? I ask your majesty for a home established for this child and others like her, where they may be removed, cared, and educated with hope of their not becoming victims of the scourge or the disease of leprosy. So this is little Annie. I think this is the person she held, or she would hold. This is little Annie, the little girl. Queen Kapiolani arose from her seat, came forward and down the steps, stood on the last step, thrust her arms out and asked the child to be given to her, which was done. She took hold and kissed the child and hugged it to her breast. And in a low voice to the speaker said, "A comely child." You know, in Hawaii or whenever anybody picks up the babies, right? Oh, cute, the baby, right? It's a comely child. And asked for the mother of the child. A woman sitting in the rear among the crowd was pointed out to the queen. The queen, in restoring the child to its mother, said to her, "Take good care of the child. When the home is built and ready for use, let her go." To this request of the queen, the mother gave assent. Now, when I read this, whenever I read this story or these quotes from Ambrose Hutchinson of what happened that day, I think about the parents, I think about the little girls, and I think about the sacrifice that the parents were asking, right? Please take these children. They love these children. These are their children born there in Kalaupapa. Please take these children who do not have leprosy, but if they stay here long enough, they might, right? Please take them away and educate them somewhere else so they don't get the disease. Now, later on in the 1900s, the government would force people to send their children away. All babies born in Kalaupapa would be sent away, or be taken to orphanages on Oahu, right? But at this point in time, it had not been done. So they're asking the queen, please build a home for our children and take them away. What sacrifice? So corporal works of mercy, right? The queen at that point, at that moment is promising them, I'll do it. I'll build the home. This is what you're asking me to do. I will do it. And so sheltering the homeless comes in many different forms. And sometimes it's queens that can do it, right? If queens are listening to the people and what their needs are. I always consider Kapiolani as a servant leader, as her leadership style. She's very, very high ranking in Hawaiian history, yet she's very, very humble. And she really cares for those in need, very much so, right? So she's going to shelter the homeless. She promises them, I will build the home. This is in July of 1884. By November of 1885, it is built. Remember, I just told you about the inspection that was happening in May of 1885 when the king and queen visited. Well, they already knew that it was in the works, right? They're building this home, and the home would be completed by the end of October 1885, and the big ceremony would take place in 1885. Walter Murray Gibson was trying to time it so that it would be the anniversary, the second anniversary of the sisters arriving, the Sisters of St. Francis, because they arrived in November 8, 1883, but November 8th was a Sunday, so he couldn't have the ceremonies on a Sunday. They moved it to the Monday. So notice the dedication program. It says, of the Kapiolani home devoted to the care of girls, the children of leprous parents not yet confirmed as lepers and others suspected of the disease. So this idea that you would have a home for the girls, so they don't have any evidence of the disease, right? Their parents have the disease, but they're suspected they might have it only because they were exposed to it. So you got to educate them separately from others, right? So look at the amount of money that our queen raised. So when she first got back, she told the legislatures that this is what she wanted to do. The Board of Health knew about it. Gibson knew about it as well. And they promised her, and they said, yes, we'll get you the money. We like it. It's a great idea, right? But, you know, as things happened, the legislature didn't come through. There was no money to be had. So the queen had made her promise. So she said, I will still build it. So she goes around raising the money. So unlike with Alexander Liholiho, Kamehameha IV, and his wife, Queen Emma, when they went around to raise the money for their Queen's Hospital that they built in 1860, they went around door to door to all the people, and everybody contributed to try to raise money for the Queen's Hospital. In this particular incident, what Kapiolani does, I say, is far more efficient, because what she did was she tapped the wealthy people in Honolulu at that time to raise the money quickly. So Claus Spreckles, who is a sugar baron from San Francisco, ends up in Hawaii. So Claus Spreckles ends up giving $2,000, and then she tapped other family members in the royal family to give as well as herself. So she raised $6,575 pretty quickly. In modern times, that's over $187,000, right? And this is the picture of the ceremony that took place that day. And so there was actually, when you look at the newspapers, they talked about it. So that in November 9, in the Pacific Commercial Advertiser, the heading or the headline said, Kapiolani Home, a noble institution to be dedicated today by Her Majesty the Queen. And then quoting from the newspaper article, Their Majesties the King and Queen have taken great interest in the institution, and it is on their unwearied exertions in great measure that the auspicious event of today takes place. Wow, they write really interesting. Yeah, we don't write like that anymore. Unwearied exertions in great measure, right? That the auspicious event of today takes place. Queen Kapiolani has been incessant in her efforts to ensure the success of this enterprise, the home being named after Her Majesty as a tribute to her love and sympathy for the afflicted of her own race and sex. So they really are attributing it to Kapiolani. It's her idea. She got this idea from the people and she's going to make it happen. And this is why the home is named after her. So here's the program. You'll see that they started with Bishop of Olba. So this is our Bishop Herman, right? And then there's a song, and then there's Gibson gets up. And by the way, Gibson, when he gives a speech, it's always long. He's not good at being short. So when I looked at the newspaper article, I think his speech, it runs quite long, like 3 columns out of the 5 columns in the newspaper on that page. And then Queen Kapiolani gets up. So you can see sort of the whole, what's happening there. So the address by Walter Murray Gibson, again, 3 columns in the 5 columns of the newspaper article, all about this ceremony. What he does say regarding Mother Marriane and the sisters in his address, he says, this little band of heroic and faithful women, shall I speak in praise of the work done by the sisters? I think not. Mere praise for such work as theirs would be entirely out of place, but I will say that they have won the hearts of our sufferers whom they care for, and in return, let us revere them in our memories and never forget the coming of the American mission of charity and the landing of the Sisters' Day. That's what he wanted to say, that day was the day of November 8th, I guess, was supposed to be celebrating the landing of the Sisters' Day. So he gives a long speech. I read the whole article. It was sort of making me tired, but he's a politician, right? And he holds many jobs in the government. He's president of the Board of Health. So it's a very long speech. And by the way, and I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say this, but he has a crush on Mother Marriane. I'm pretty sure Mother Marriane never led him on, right? But he basically does. The way he writes about her, he's very much infatuated with Mother Marriane. And she's the saint now, right? So she's this lovely lady who's treating him with respect and everything. But boy, yeah. So we have photos. So if the photos I'm going to be showing you soon, take a look and see if you can find Gibson in the photos, right? He's kind of photobombing the photos that's are to come. Okay, so there's your program, all of the music and everything happening. So right after that ceremony, the dedication took place, and King Kalakaua calls Mother Marriane to have a seat next to him, and he decorated her with the Companion of the Royal Order of Kapiolani. And this is the royal order we use to recognize people in our kingdom who have provided great humanitarian efforts and assisting our people. And so he wanted to recognize her. It was so quietly and unobtrusively done that the people in the audience probably didn't even know it was happening. But I believe the Sisters of St. Francis have this medal in their collection, right? Because it was given to Mother Marriane. So Queen Kapiolani wanted to honor our Mother Marriane, our saint. So the remaining pictures, basically, if we take a look, in 1886, there was a photographer that came by and started taking all these pictures. So you can see the convent on the left. You know, on the other side of that fence is the branch hospital because it's on the same block, right, in Kaka'ako. So here's the picture of the sisters. And we can see, you can see Gibson there on the left. You can see the 10 children from Kalaupapa, the 10 girls who were brought over, including little Annie on the right there. That little picture there on the right, that girl on the far right, that's little Annie. So this home was built to house 50 girls. So 50 girls would be in this home. At this point, this was just the first 10 that were sent over from Kalaupapa. And if you take a closer look at them, I look at this picture of the girls and it's, you know, they're not happy, right? In fact, I did find an article in the newspaper, Daily Bulletin on August 5th, 1886. And it says, and the article said, escaped from the home. So the girls had escaped. 7 girls, children of lepers on Molokai, who were recently brought to Honolulu and put into the Kapiolani home at the Kaka'ako Branch Hospital, escaped about 9 or 10 o'clock on Tuesday night. That was August 3rd, I guess, of 1886. They were more or less, they were with more or less difficulty overtaken and returned to the home by policemen. But at 5 o'clock next morning, they again got out and scaled the high fence of the hospital grounds and escaped. All efforts to recapture them since have failed, although the police were promised a reward for bringing them back. Either they are hiding in the bush or abandoned by friends. So that's or harbored by friends, harbored by friends. So that's August 5th, 1886. So I'm looking at these girls, and poor thing. So they were brought over from Kalaupapa. Some of them had been living with their families, and some of them, their families had passed on. So they were living with others who took them in, or they were helping. They might have served as kokua, or helpers, because they didn't have the disease. So they had a different kind of life in Kalaupapa, not a very structured life, a much more free life, if you will. But when they get to the home, there's structure, you have to obey, there's certain things you have to do. It's not a very, they're not very happy. So they run away a number of times. So that's just one article expressing that. So Gibson has to be called, and he has to go and figure it out. At one point, I think Father Damien was visiting at one time, and he helped as well. He knew the girls, and they were so happy to see him. So it wasn't easy. It wasn't an easy adjustment for them. And little Annie, even I tried to hunt down little Annie, yeah, and it doesn't end well for her either. So I believe, if I'm not certain, but I believe she committed suicide in her 20s, but I'm not sure. That's where I was heading down that route, kind of researching it, and I wasn't quite sure if that was the person, if that what happened. So it wasn't quite a happy life. So we can't paint this as sort of rosy. It's wonderful. It's better than it was, I guess, right? And we are looking out for the best of them, but the transition is not going to be easy. These girls are not happy, and it's going to be hard work. And the sisters are working super hard, because they are working both at the branch hospital and at the Kapiolani Home for Girls. And we have sent a few sisters to work at the Wailuku Hospital, Malulani Hospital on Maui, right? So the sisters are working doubly hard as well. So there you can see Gibson, this time standing right next to Mother Marriane, right? So I think he's photobombing all of these pictures with the sisters. So there he is again. There he is yet again. There he is again, right? I showed that picture earlier of the sisters. So you can see in this picture that they are on the veranda, or on the patio there of the Kapiolani Home for Girls, right? Because you can see the picture of the home, right? And that is the patio where they're standing, where the photographer took the photo. So I just like looking at these ancient pictures. Oh, not ancient, they're 1886, they're not that ancient, but old. Let's see, so the other homes, so they closed down the Kapiolani Home for Girl and the Kaka'ako Branch Hospital in 92. And they moved them to Kalihi. So the second location was at the Kalihi Hospital and Receiving Station. So they were there for about 8 years, and the sisters were still caring for them at this location, at all the locations. The third location was actually in the third location was actually at the play camp in 1900, also in Kalihi, this time near the pumping station in Waikamilo Road. So I don't know if you realize that Chinatown, there was a big fire in 1900. And so people were displaced and homeless. So they had a plague camp. There was a bubonic plague, and that's why we had the whole Chinatown fire in 1900, different story. And then Kapiolani Home for Girls in Kalihi Uka. So this is the last one, the fourth location. The sisters were still helping with these girls. So it's basically an orphanage, right? Or it's a place where they're sending these girls whose parents have been sent to Kalaupapa because they have leprosy. And so that closed down finally in 1938. So that's what I have. I need to work on my my endings, but here's the sources. So you'll have access to the PDF of my PowerPoint, which will have these sources in them. So I am done, and these are the sources, and you'll have access to them. So sorry about that. I think I went a little bit over time. I apologize. 1 minute over time. Sorry, sister. Yeah. Okay. I've seen the message. Okay. Questions and comments. I apologize. I'm a little bit over.
That's okay, Colette. I want to thank you for definitely doing a wonderful job. Presenting again, just like you did on Damien, and on behalf of the sisters, mahalo nui loa for doing, again, cannot thank you enough for your passion for this and for what you've shared. So if you have questions, please type it in the chat box, and we will address them with Colette for the extra few minutes that we may have. So if you want to stay on and ask questions, please do so at this time.
I know I talk fast. There must be something. I can flip back to a slide if you want me to. Yeah.
Cheryl, this is Ed Paz. I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
I'm curious if in your references you have references to the Maui Lani Hospital that and how it was started and any stories about that hospital, because that's where I'm working right now.
Oh.
So I'm interested in learning more about, you know, her role in founding the hospital and all of that, how it happened.
Is this a question for me? I thought
Yes,
you said
yes,
Cheryl.
I'm
Oh,
sorry.
okay, sorry. Okay,
Colette, Colette, please.
yes, so I see it inside that book, right? So this book that was written, they do a good job of it. So Henley, Sister Mary Lawrence, right? And O.A. Bushnell, they write that book, Pilgrimage and Exile. So they do talk about her being asked by Queen Kapiolani to open up another hospital on Maui. It was Malulani Hospital, and the sisters did run it. And then they opened up also the school, St. Anthony's School there. So it was started by the sisters. So that hospital there today is this Malulani Hospital was a predecessor of the one that is there today. I don't know enough about what they did to set up there. I do know that Sister Marriane was called back because of that whole excitement at Kaka'ako that happened in March of 84, right? She was called back to deal with that. So she was back on Oahu by mid-March, yet they still hadn't finished setting up everything in Maui. So she had to leave the two sisters there to set everything up. But I don't know enough. I know that Mother Marriane had experience running that hospital, like St. Joseph Hospital in New York, was it? So she was very experienced as a hospital administrator, had many years of experience prior to coming to Honolulu, prior to working at Kaka'ako Hospital. And so she was the right person, I think, to set it up. But it seemed like they were stretched. The number of sisters they had at that time, what was it, only 11, I think, by April of 84, maybe 11 sisters, is that right? One passes away not too long after they were here. So I don't know, not a lot of sisters. To me, it's like if you got like 10 or 11 sisters and you're trying to do Kaka'ako Branch Hospital, Kapiolani Home for Girls, and Wailuku Hospital, Malulani, that's really hard. So I know it was stressful and they seem stretched. It seems like when I read from Sister Mary Lawrence's writings there, when I read about it, and she's looking at Leopoldina's journal, and she's looking at others who have written, the sisters have written some stuff. It seems like they were stressed. It's like it's mimicking what probably our current medical health professionals go through, right? These days when it's stress and stress, you're working, you don't get any rest, right? It just seems like that they're super stressed, but they continue to do it. It seems to be their call. I wish I knew more. I haven't done enough research on that. So if anybody else knows, please chime in. I don't know enough.
Colette. Hi, Colette, this is Sister Alicia.
Hi. Yes, sister, you must know. Yes.
I think what had happened was that Queen Kapiolani had asked Mother in January of 1884 to open up a hospital. The structure was already built. So what she asked to do was to go in and supply it, fix it up, and hire the staff to be able to do that. Now it wasn't until April of 84 when I believe it was Princess Leopoldina came, and so we asked her to dedicate it and to ask her, would you name the hospital? And that's why it was named Malulani. And then of course that time there were problems in Honolulu, so then Mother went back to take care of it. Right, and it was very interesting, your comment about, the Kaka'ako receiving station, because what she told them is that if Van Giesen did not as superintendent, she would take the sisters back to Syracuse.
That was a good ultimatum. It was the ultimatum that finally pushed everybody, the government, to make the right decision.
Absolutely.
Good for her.
She was determined to take care of the people as she had promised the Queen.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because it seems like when I read Sister Mary Lawrence's book, she writes really well. She describes everything, right? And so I get the sense that so Gibson was being a typical politician. So even though he knew that Van Giesen was not a nice guy, he wasn't about to remove him. He's just kind of playing it a political way, right? And so she finally had to ask, and I guess she didn't, even though Queen Kapiolani was helping. It seems like Queen Kapiolani was also instrumental in putting that guy in that place in the first place. So I'm not sure she's the right person to be objective about this, right? But I guess if push comes to shove, you choose the sisters over Van Giesen, right? So Van Giesen wasn't doing a good job, and so that ultimatum worked. And so he ended up back so they moved into Kalaupapa at that point. And so in Kalaupapa, his job was to build a new home, I think, for the doctor, right? That was going to come. And so when Queen Kapiolani visited in July of 84, her and Liliuokalani and her traveling party, they stayed in that brand new home that wasn't yet open. It was finished. Van Giesen had finished it, but it wasn't yet open for the doctor to arrive. So they actually stayed there when they stayed those 2 days. So I like it that, Mother Marriane pretty much, says it's ultimatum is him or our sisters. You guys got to get rid of him. They get rid of him. They send him to Kalaupapa. Not too long after that, Father Damien is writing to Queen Kapiolani and saying, you got to get rid of this guy. And in the letter that Damien or Mother Mary, no, what is it? Damien's writing to Queen Kapiolani. Kapiolani writes, I will deal with this, right? So somehow he's gone. He's gone by the fall of 84. He's no longer in Kalaupapa. So you just think of this Van Giesen guy. That excitement at Kalaupapa is early March of 1884. He's got to be run out, to Kalaupapa. He's sent to Kalaupapa by July of 84, and then he's gone by the fall of 84. So even Father Damien didn't want that angry Haole, which is how Kapiolani wrote it. They didn't want the angry Haole there in Kalaupapa either. He was not a nice guy, and I think ultimately he was not respecting the patients. He was treating them not as humans, basically, right? It was just very odd the way he wasn't a nice guy. Sorry.
So again, Colette, thanks. And Sister Alicia, thank you for adding to that. Just based on, want to be conscious of the time for people. So we had a couple of questions, which thank you, Donna, for answering. Again, if you want to see the previous slides and presentations, go to dmcchawaii.org. Hawaii is spelled out. And so that's where we will post this recording along with the PDF of the slides that Colette presented today. And so those will probably go out in another couple of weeks because we've got to edit the presentation and make sure we captured everything. And if anything got dropped, we will be able to re-record. So we want to again thank you, Colette, for doing this. We also want to share with you that on December 11th, we will be wrapping up the series for this year with a presentation on Joseph Dutton. And so I know Ed's online, so he will definitely be one of our speakers of 3. We will have Patrick Boland, who did many tours in Kalaupapa. Ed, who's now currently in Maui and is part of the guild for the cause for Joseph Dutton, and Father Jean, who is from Vermont, who will speak about the church that is dedicated to Dutton, actually on his homestead there in Stowe, Vermont. So we're looking forward for the 3 of them to present on Dutton, and to thank all of you who were present today for being here, for those who have donated to this cause. And there was a question about how do we continue all of this? It is by your support for all of these presentations. We thank everyone for participating. And again, if you feel so inclined, add us to your Christmas list for donations. As you can imagine, there is a cost for us to do so. So again, thank you so much. But we're going to ask Colette at the end to definitely end us with a prayer, and she will do it in Hawaiian.
Yes, I will do the Lord's Prayer in Hawaiian, which is, I always think of it like our queen would have used this prayer because she was, she's a Christian, she's an Anglican, so she would have said Our Father, our Lord's Prayer in Hawaiian. So would have Damien and Mother Marriane, right? Because they all knew Hawaiian. So, e pule kako, e koma kua I loko kalani, e ho'anu ia ko inoa, e hiki mai ko aupuni, e malama ia ko make ma ka honua nei, e liki me ia, e malama ia ma kalani la, e ha'awe mai ia mako I ke ia la, I aina mako no ne ia la, e kalamai ho'i ia mako, I ka mako lawe hala ana, me mako e kalane I ka po'e, e lawe hana I ka mako, mai ho'oku'u oia, mako I ka ho'o vale ia mai, e ho'o pākele no na ia mako I ka ino. No ka mea, no ke aupuni, ame ka mana, ame ka ho'onani ia, ama loa aku. Amen. So it's our Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. There you
Again,
go.
thank you so much. Mahalo. Thank you all,
Mahalo.
everyone, for joining
Mahalo.
us.
Thank you for
See you in
joining us.
December.
Yes. Mahalo,
Thank you.
mahalo. Thank you all.